University and Senior Fellow at the Smithsonian's National Museum of American History. His new book is called The American Bible: How Our Words Unite, Divide, and Define a Nation. Join the conversation by calling in now to 1-800-933-5372 or send email to think@kera.org. Stephen, you mentioned a few minutes ago that it was after the Cold War that a lot of more specific religious language found its way into shared national texts. And one really interesting example here is the Pledge of Allegiance, which, of course, existed for a very long time before the words "under God" were inserted.
Right. We got the Pledge of Allegiance in the 1890s, and we had some controversy about it in terms of whether we should be forcing kids to stand up and say particular words. Maybe that was something that we shouldn't do. Maybe that was something that fascists might do or Nazis might do, but maybe we shouldn't do it. But the big controversy came, and a lot of Supreme Court decisions or arguments came with inserting "under God," which is language that actually Lincoln used in the Gettysburg Address, had been floating around before in American society with this idea of Americans as a chosen people. And then under Eisenhower during the Cold War, that became a way to distinguish ourselves from the Soviets, that they didn't believe in God and we did. We were one nation under God and they were one nation without God. And that added a whole new layer of controversy because it seemed to say that the United States was somehow a monotheistic country, and therefore people who were atheists or even people who were polytheists who believed that there was more than one God might really not be true Americans.
And it's interesting, you also include some text from a speech that Ronald Reagan made here in Dallas in 1984, at which he lamented the fact that perhaps we had sort of lost, as Americans, the protection of God since the 1960s.
Yeah, I struggled with what to include for Reagan because he has so many really iconic and important speeches. He has, Mr. Gorbachev tear down that wall, and he has his speech about the evil empire. But I think the classic Reagan utterance is this speech that's been called "A Time for Choosing." It's also been called simply "The Speech," delivered in 1964 on behalf of Barry Goldwater. And there he really lays out what becomes the ideological stream of the Republican Party for the next half century, right up until today. And he does a number of things in that speech. One is he takes aim at the 60s. And he talks this moral language about how the Republicans are really the party that is not going along with the moral relativism of the 1960s. And then he also talks about how the dangers of communism aren't just abroad, but they're also inside our own country, that we have a kind of socialist creep where we're gradually expanding the jobs of the state and raising taxes in order to support it. And that critique becomes particularly prominent there. But what's missing in the speech, which was fascinating to me, is this kind of exuberance and optimism that we associate with Reagan. This kind of, it's always the morning in America when you wake up. And that's really not there. It's kind of a dour, gloomy sort of speech and quite different from things we would later expect of Reagan. But a lot of the building blocks for what we now think of as the Reagan Revolution can be found in that speech.
I think it could fairly be argued that Ronald Reagan has become one of the sort of secular saints of this country, along with, everyone from the Founding Fathers to Martin Luther King. Can you talk about how once we have sort of declared an American to be a great American, the mythology mixes with the reality of what they might have said and what they might have stood for?
Yeah, exactly. I think that's right. And once they're gone and they can no longer speak for themselves, I think that process starts, and we then take over for them. This is something you see in literature about saints and martyrs. Who makes a saint and a martyr? It's not the person themselves. It's the believers who decide after they die that they are, this kind of person, a person to be revered. And I think that that's absolutely happening with Reagan. I think that you can see in the Republican Party, in the primaries, this real desire to be the next Ronald Reagan. But at the same time, you see all sorts of contradictions between what Republicans do today and what Reagan was doing. I think, I thought Reagan was pretty far to the right when he was running for president in 1980, but I think he would be far too far to the left now to get elected or to get the nomination of the Republicans. because he was willing to raise taxes. For example, he was willing to work with the Democrats in the House and the Senate in order to pass legislation.
1-800-933-5372 is our telephone number. Let's speak with Scott in Plano. Hi, Scott.
Hi. This sounds like a very fascinating book, and although I haven't read it, I hate to put any criticisms, but it sounds like also it could be a book that just focuses on the kinds of documents or ideas that we all like now. And yet I wonder if you have anything in it that would be like the Dred Scott decision or others who are arguing for slavery, for example, either before or after the Civil War, that were very influential also. Thanks for your call.
Yeah, that's a good question. Is this all just kind of the sunny side, the cheery side of American history? And my answer is that there is discussion in the book of the Dred Scott decision. There is discussion of this kind of seamy side of American life, particularly when it comes to slavery and when it comes to segregation. Mostly though, those, for example, the Dred Scott decision that's really excluding African Americans from citizenship, that is not included as one of my core texts because I don't think it has the kind of iconic status that Brown v. Board of Education does. But the debates about slavery are definitely in the book. We hear the voices of Lincoln, but we also hear the side of Douglas in the Lincoln Douglas debates. And the same goes with conversations about the Constitution of people who are in favor of states' rights, people who are in favor of a strong central government. All these kind of central debates we have in American society, they're all represented in the book, and both sides are represented. In fact, in my hometown newspaper here in Boston, the Boston Globe, they did a review where the complaint was that there were too many conservative voices in the book, and that it should have been a more liberal book.
1-800-933-5372 is our telephone number. Let's speak with Will in Fort Worth. Hi, Will.
Hi. I was just wondering how had Ayn Rand's ideas permeated through American culture?
Ayn Rand, I don't know if you could hear that, Stephen, and this was the only text you wished to include that you weren't able to actually copy in the book.
That's right. Ayn Rand's Atlas Shrugged is in my book. I have in the section on Chronicles, I have 3 novels, Huckleberry Finn, which is important, of course, for being, according to some, the most racist book in American literature, and then according to others, the most anti-racist book in American literature. So it's a classic case of controversy. And then I also have Uncle Tom's Cabin by Harriet Beecher Stowe, the anti-slavery novel that some think is the most important book ever published in America for helping to bring the North around to being willing to go to war in the Civil War. And then I included Ayn Rand's Atlas Shrugged because I think it's the classic example of the argument on behalf of capitalism. Capitalism as a moral good, greed as a moral good. Long before Wall Street and Gordon Gekko said greed is good, Ayn Rand was saying the same thing. So she's in there. But unfortunately, we weren't able to reprint this great speech by this gentleman, D'Anconia, this copper magnate who's in the book, on the virtues of money, because the estate of Ayn Rand wouldn't allow us to include it in the book because they didn't want it to be alongside criticisms. And luckily, that was the only person who said no to us. I think the rest appreciated this idea of presenting these core texts alongside arguments about them, both pro and con, and seeing that as very much a part of the American project.
Let's talk a little bit more about the adventures of Huckleberry Finn, which I think Americans today forget that although the events took place before the Civil War, in fact, it was written after the Civil War, when Mark Twain was clearly aware that our problems with figuring out race and equality were just beginning.
Right. Well, oh my gosh, there's so much written about Huck Finn because of course, it's been in our canon, it's been in our high schools for decades. And what to me is fascinating about the book is, first of all, it attends to what I see as the major challenge in American history, which is the challenge of race. And we have all sorts of challenges around gender and around class and all sorts of questions. But I think race is the question that gave us our Civil War. It's a question that has defined the nation more than any other. And Huckleberry Finn attends to that in a way that's entertaining, that gives us a new way of writing novels, really, in the vernacular. So we get to hear this kid talking the way kids spoke in the South before the Civil War. We got to hear the language of the slave Tom, who very much turns around into this Uncle Tom characterization that Malcolm X would go on and label Martin Luther King an Uncle Tom, even though the Tom character in the book is at least intended by Stowe to be very. I'm sorry. Whoops! I skipped over to Uncle Tom's Cabin. I'm sorry.
It's easy. Well, they're in the same chapter.
The books in my, but at any rate, in the Huck Finn story, you have the use of the N word over 200 times, and this is really offensive to a lot of African Americans today who just think it ought to not be in our libraries and shouldn't be in our schools, and yet others say no. This is the great American novel. It brings so much into American literature in terms of its focus on the vernacular, and it also is a classic statement of opposition to racism. So is it a racist book or is it an anti-racist book? That's the big question about Huck Finn.
I want to talk about this for a minute because you remind us here that things have been worse, that we do stand a chance at moving back to a period of more civil discourse. Do you think, though, that the fact that, in past generations, we weren't arguing yet about things like America's role in the world, about weapons of mass destruction, about same-sex marriage, about abortion, until relatively recently, did that keep people from these entrenched positions that they've taken today?
I don't think so. I don't think the change is that the issues have become more momentous. Because in some ways the issues were more momentous in the beginning when we had a country that we thought at any moment might fall apart. I mean, that's what many Americans believed when the election of 1800 ended in a tie between John Adams and Thomas Jefferson, that whoever ended up becoming the next president, the people who opposed him were going to fight, that we're going to have civil war. And the questions about the power of the central government, the role of the states, those were hugely important questions. And I think it more monumental in some ways than the question is today of gay marriage. I think certain things have changed. One is the arrival of religion into the center of American political life. And that with it has come the language of sort of absolute good and absolute evil, a kind of light and darkness language that you can see often in religious institutions, but that we had avoided until relatively recently in American life. I think that's one thing. I think a second change that's brought on our kind of partisanship epidemic has been the rise of cable news and also a commercial talk radio, which has really polarized us and taken us back to a situation that we had in the early republic when all our newspapers and all our media were basically partisan, and it was much easier to drum people up into kind of fever craziness like we had in the election of 1800. I think that's changed. And then another thing that's changed, and this is an argument I make in the book, is that we have forgotten the great voices of conciliation in American public life, the people who tell us, let's be Americans first, let's be Republicans or Democrats second. And all these great figures in this book make that argument. Thomas Jefferson makes it in his first inaugural when he says we are all Republicans, we are all Federalists. John Kennedy, in his inaugural, says that civility is not a sign of weakness. Patrick Henry says, I'm not a Virginian, I'm an American. And I think we've lost that. I think we've forgotten that. And I think that we're kind of playing this game. It's almost like sport, that we're trying to win the argument or we're trying to put down the other party. And we've forgotten that the purpose of our public life is to create a common space for the common good. And I think the more we listen to these voices in the book, the more we can be called back to that higher purpose for our country.
When we think about Americans who really stood for and modeled civil disobedience, we think of Martin Luther King, we think of people like Cesar Chavez. We don't necessarily, in this time and age, think about Henry David Thoreau.
Yes, although he's the one who really gave us that tradition in American life. It was funny to make the decision to not include Walden, which so many people read, at least in New England, in high school, and to include civil disobedience instead. But I think civil disobedience is probably the the most powerfully influential essay ever.